Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Read Chinese Poetry podcast. I'm Zong-qi, the program host. In this podcast program, my colleagues and I aim to introduce cutting-edge scholarship on Chinese poetry to a broad general audience. We will present 52 episodes covering the major poetic genres developed over China's long history. Each episode features close reading of one or more of the best-known Chinese poems, with an aim to illuminate their literary greatness and cultural significance. For all the discussed poems, Chinese text, English translation, romanization, and brief notes are provided at our website, howtoreadchinesepoetry.com. By following the 52 episodes, listener will gain a bird's-eye view of the thematic, formal, and generic evolution of Chinese poetry from antiquity to the modern era. Instruct and delight is what we wish to accomplish in each talk. Without further ado, let's begin. Today, we are on to the last episode on the topic. We'll focus on two interpretive strategies employed by Han commentators: structural ambiguity and interiorization. By interiorization, I mean a commentator's reading of an external scene as an imagined interior one. The poem chosen for our discussion is "In the Wild, There's a Dead Doe."
In the wilds there is a dead doe. With white rushes we cover her. There was a lady longing for the spring. A fair night seduced her. In the wood there is a clump of oaks, and in the wilds a dead deer with white rushes well bound. There was a lady fair as jade. Hey, not so hasty, not so rough. Hey, do not touch my handkerchief. Take care, or the dog will bark.
In this short poem, we encounter several gaps as we read and listen to it. From the opening line, we are confronted with a juxtaposition of a dead doe and a beautiful pining woman. Just as we are wondering about this juxtaposition, we encounter an even greater gap between the third-person description in the first two stanzas and the first-person speech in the last stanza. These gaps within and between stanzas create a very serious structural ambiguity and a lot of uncertainty in meaning from such yoking of disjointed parts. Owing to its structural ambiguity, Han commentator found it much harder to turn this love poem into a moral tale than they did the other two poems we discussed in the previous episodes. Indeed, it took three prominent commentators to join forces to tackle it, thereby producing three layers of commentary. The first is the foundational commentary made by the author of the prefaces to the Book of Poetry. He writes, quote, "In the wilds there's a dead doe expresses abhorrence and impropriety. As the world was in turmoil, acts of violence were inflicted on people and licentious acts became rampant. But thanks to the transforming influence of King Wen, people still abhorred impropriety even in this time of chaos." Unquote. This passage identifies an abhorrence of violent and licentious act as the poem's theme, Yet, it makes no reference to the poem's actual content, and for a good reason. The poem embodies the very impropriety he condemned: licentious conduct, and to a lesser extent, violence. The stark contradiction between his commentary and the poem was not lost on his successors. But instead of throwing away this commentary, later commentators chose to rationalize it as well as they could. The reason is pretty straightforward. The prefaces to the Book of Poetry had already acquired authoritative status and set the interpretive framework for the poems. So, when adding the second layer of commentary, a scholar named Mao tried hard to find signs of good conduct that would support this interpretation of the poem as abhorrence of moral improprieties. He landed on the wrapping of the dead doe in clean white rushes. He writes, quote, "The impropriety at issue refers to doing away with matchmaking, not sending engagement gifts of wild geese and silk, and kidnapping and coercing a woman into marriage. It was the time of Zhou, the last Shang dynasty king. In times of calamity or famine, engagement gifts were reduced but still made. The dead doe in the wild was the spoil of hunting and could be carved up and its meat shared. The white rushes were used to wrap it in order to keep it clean and pure." Turning the first two stanzas from courtship into proper performance of engagement ritual, commentator Mao ignored the third stanza and left the issue of violence unaddressed. So, when adding the third layer of commentary, Zheng Xuan focused on the last stanza, reinterpreting it as an outcry against the kidnapping and coercing of women. Without spelling it out, he obviously took the last stanza to be a woman's words of resistance against violence. This reading fails to convince, though, because the line suggests only a half-hearted reprimand of a clumsy lover. Moreover, in casting the intruder as violent, Zheng creates a new contradiction he will have to resolve. Why is this alleged perpetrator portrayed in so positive a light in the preceding stanza, even called a fair knight? It is hard to imagine so fair a knight as a kidnapper of women. To reason away this contradiction, Zheng comes up with a most ingenious solution. Taking the first two stanzas not as depiction of a real person, but as the flash of imagination by a virtuous woman wishing to see someone come with the hunted doe meat as the engagement gift. Elaborating on this point, Zheng writes, quote, "A virtuous woman yearning to meet a fine man in accordance with rituals during mid-spring. A meeting properly arranged by a matchmaker sent by the man." Unquote. To emphasize these scenes as imagined rather than actual, Zheng adds, quote, "All this was said to disapprove the practice of impropriety at the time." Unquote. In other words, these imagined scenes not only express her unobtainable wish, but convey her social criticism. Zheng's interiorization of the first two stanzas is no doubt a stroke of genius. It is hard to imagine a better rationalization for the first layer of commentary introduced by the author of the prefaces. Now, for some reflection on the entire topic. In tracing how Han commentator reinterpreted three love poems, we have seen how resourceful they were, injecting moral significance into poems of any kind, even those whose contents are outright immoral by Confucian standards. By deploying a rich array of interpretive strategies, including gender switching, quote, cutting off a section to create a new meaning, unquote, structural ambiguity, and interiorization, Han commentators brilliantly succeeded in turning the 305 Shijing poems into a compendium of moral lessons, and thereby elevated the book of poetry to the Confucian canon. In the eyes of modern literary scholars, the canonization of the book of poetry came at a too heavy a price. Its poetic beauty is destroyed. It is surely true that the countless lovely, emotionally rich poems were reduced to dull, tone-deaf moral lessons. But too often lost in this complaint is the ironic fact that the interpretive process that uses such dull readings is itself an admirable exercise of literary imagination. And this overlooked fact actually has profound implications for the subsequent development of Chinese poetry. Immersed since childhood in the study of the book of poetry along with Han commentaries, poets of later time inevitably absorb Han commentators' keen sensitivity to the expressive potential of ambiguities in the Chinese language, and apply their interpretive tools to exploit the ambiguities for their own poetic creations. Indeed, when we think about how Du Fu, Li Shangyin, and other great Tang poets exploit semantic, syntactic, and structural ambiguities, it is impossible for us not to see the tremendous depth they owed Han commentators. So this is the end of the third topic on the book of poetry. Next week, we'll get started on the first of two topics on the lyrics of the Chu, or Chu Ci. Professor Fu Sheng Wu of the University of Utah will be our guest host. That's all for today. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Let us relax and listen to a reading of the poem in Mandarin.
诗经少南也有死君，也有死君，白毛包之，有女怀春，即是诱之。邻有仆宿，也有死鹿，白毛纯树，有女如玉。疏而退退兮，无憾我睡兮，无始忙也废。